some time to clear my sight. Need some time to clear my sight. Don't see you in the same light. Light.
Well, I guess we don't need the voice of God from the back of the room saying, please be quiet, we're about to begin. Just the lights went down and the silence came in. Good evening and welcome. I am delighted for the conversation we are about to all participate in. With us tonight is Sukhinder Cassidy, who has a lot of accolades, most of which were mentioned in the announcement for this program, but I will just mention two. She is the founder of the Board List, which is a remarkable vehicle to bring greater diversity, particularly greater women, to board service, and has done some remarkable stuff in the Bay Area and around the country. And she is the former CEO of StubHub, and a whole bunch of other accolades. But the one we are here to talk about tonight is her first book, Choose Possibility, Take Risks and Thrive Even When You Fail. We met several years ago, and I am delighted that the Battery let me be the one who interviews her. My name is J.D. Schramm, for those who I haven't met here. I'm one of the creative in residence here at the Battery, and love to get to do programs like this for Battery members. I'm going to ask the first several questions, and then I will open it up to the audience to ask questions. You don't have to have read the book in order to ask a question, but it will make your question better if you've done so. So do with that as you wish. And I think if you just came in, we have on the screens the URL if you want to take the possibility risk assessment and find out what type of risk taker you are. I would urge, don't do it now if you haven't already done it, but do it after the program. You might want to take a photo of that URL. So with that, we will move into our conversation. Hi, Sukhinder.
Hello. Nice to see you all. Thank you for coming out on a rainy night.
We have
when
both...
you could be home watching the Warriors. My kids are at the Warriors. I think it's pretty good competition for this. So I'm particularly appreciative that you're here.
And if anybody starts cheering in the midst, we will know that they're getting score reports probably.
Exactly.
So I love the book. I told Sukhinder I both read the book and listened to the audio version of the book. I would switch back and forth between the two. So she and I have been commuting for most of October, and now I have to figure out who I ride home with tonight. But you designed the book in 3 parts: get going, get smarter, and get rewarded. I know as an author and as a parent, you're not supposed to have favorites, but as you look at those 3 sections, which one do you find has the most juice or the most interest? You get the most engagement from people who've read the book?
Well, great question. I think that the Get Smarter is probably the second. If you were only going to read one section of the book, you can read Get Smarter. I think the Get Smarter section has the most resonance because I think Get Going is sort of like very simple, practical tips, and for anybody just to think about how you basically get started in kind of being a better choice maker. But it's like in some ways to me very obvious, maybe not to others. But I think that Get Smarter, really most people find in it like some nugget that is applicable to their current lives. Whereas anyway, so that's my favorite section. I think it has a decent number of frameworks, a really good number of stories. But I think for most of us, I think it's about becoming a smarter risk taker. Like when people are like, have a growth mindset, make new choices. I mean, it's like all well and good, but I think what people really want is like, give me the insights and give me something new, like something I haven't thought about before. So a lot of people are like, oh, in that section, you made me think about this a different way. So that's actually fun for me to hear.
Got it. I love that. And I did enjoy the frameworks that you offered throughout it. I didn't realize, because I've read the book in stages, that the assessment wasn't in the book itself.
No.
And so it determines, if you've done this, that you're either a calculator, a change seeker, a contemplator, or a critic. I also love alliteration. So the 4 C's really is nice.
It's really hard to come up with those names, yes.
So what are you? Which of the 4 are you?
I'm a calculator. So first of all, how many of you have read the book? And I really have no offense whatsoever if you haven't read the book. Yeah, so it might be worth us just stepping back, and I'm happy to give you the premise of the book if that's useful.
Yeah, that would be great.
But I'm a calculator, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So look, the core thesis of the book is remarkably simple. It's so simple that when I decided to write the book, which is just as we were selling StubHub, I really, I called an agent. I was like, I think this might be so obvious that I'm not sure it's worth writing a book on. I'm like, is this so obvious? And he's like, it's not that obvious to other people. I'm like, okay. And he's like, no, we want to, I want to rep this book. I was like, okay. It seems like it's like the point you have, like, really, everybody knows this, right? So maybe there's no book here. And he was like, no, there's definitely a book here. So the core thesis of the book is that most people think about risk taking as like one large and mighty choice. And that everything that is celebrated from the outside in is the hero's journey, and Silicon Valley exacerbates this. People have this mythical view of like, what was the choice you made? What was the thing you did? Oh my goodness, Elon Musk wants to go to space. So Jeff Bezos is, fighting with him to do so. But the problem with that thesis is it's just not true, right? Like it's fundamentally not true. So I was like, everybody thinks there's a moment, that there's a choice. Everywhere I look, I see people who are like, struggling to make a choice, like struggling because they have the sense that it's either epic defeat or like a ride to glory. And I'm like, but what if you knew that it's not one choice? Like, what if you knew that, like, if you're going to just make one choice, don't bother. Like, that's actually not the way risk taking works. What if risk taking is literally a series of unlocks and you have no idea which one is going to drive yield? And it's the process and pursuit of multiple unlocks that drives yield, which is so obvious. How many of you are in tech? Some of you? Okay. It's so obvious in tech. You say to people, iterate your way to a great product. So obvious. But if I were to say like, okay, take your career and just iterate your way there, most people are like, what? Like, I need to make the perfect choice. Everything is the perfect choice. I'm like, you actually don't. Like, you're going to get much more yield if you basically treat risk like a muscle. And if you basically pursue choice making as a strategy and as a skill. And so the more you make, the better you get at it, and it's a portfolio theory of choices. And so that's the core thesis of the book. So now you don't need to read it if you don't want to. But
You could still buy it, even if you don't read it. I have lots of books on my bookshelf that.
You've never. But I think that the more important part of it is the how, right? Like when you say to people, "Be a smarter risk taker," what does that mean? If I say to you, "Get going on your choices," and there's a lot of myths in your choice making that kind of go along this myth of a single choice, which is the core choice myth in the book. There's a lot of other associated myths with risk taking that I just wanted to bust. So that people would, in fact, sort of treat it as a muscle and get the portfolio of choice results in their careers as opposed to a single choice. So anyway, that's what the book is about. And I think I'm a calculator. You can probably guess what the difference is between a calculator and a contemplator, but if you can't, before we put this risk survey out to people to take on the website, we put it out to the U.S., a sample of the U.S. Population. And 60% of the U.S. population are contemplators, right? So you're like, well, what's a contemplator? People must think a contemplator is somebody who never makes a choice. Well, not true. I know a lot of type A personalities that have achieved a lot as a contemplator. You probably do too, but this idea of the perfect choice weighs heavily, right? So when you ask a contemplator versus a calculator, what the difference is, they both have the same level of ambition, the same level of pursuit, but it's their comfort level with making a decision when you have imprecise information versus in the fear of looking imperfect, right? And so contemplators often say, yeah, my biggest regret is the decision I didn't make, which decision makers are or calculators or contemplators who basically slide over to the edge and say, any decision is better than no decision. Literally no decision will drive me crazy. Whereas a contemplator can live in indecision for a long time and that tortures them. So different things torture these two people who are two sides of the same coin. And so those are the two archetypes. And then change seeker is the least common type in the United States. And one of the most interesting things about change seekers is those are people who are very comfortable with change and adaptable. They also are always in pursuit of the new thing. Yeah. And so when you look at the change seeker, I was like, okay, you might be able to take a lot of risks, but do you get the yield for all the risks you take? All the you guys are nodding. I know all the people who have lateral careers and just keep moving. I'm like, okay, but so for a change seeker, it's almost the opposite. It's like, how do you stop and focus and make sure that you're prioritizing?
I haven't given it to him yet, but I think my 23-year-old son is a change seeker.
I'm pretty sure I was a change seeker in my 20s.
Yeah,
I mean, if I look at the number of choices I made. Yeah. By the way, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying it. This is Chatham House rules or whatever, right? The CEO of Sonos is a change seeker, right? The CEO of TripAdvisor is a change seeker. They're like, and I was like, oh, I thought you were a calculator. They're like, no, I'm a change seeker. I'm like, Patrick, what's your problem? He's like, and as he says to his employees, he's like, well, maybe I'm just telling them to pursue new ideas all the time. I'm like, yeah, Patrick, maybe your team needs you to focus. Though he's a remarkable CEO. But it's interesting, right? I think the line between a change seeker and calculator is a little more fine. And then the critic is the third most popular style in the United States. Which is somebody who just sees the harm in a situation. And we always think critics are bad, but we know in any diverse decision-making, having critics in the room is a good thing. Mm-hmm. They help you see, your failure modes. They're also really good at creating safe environments, but they have a hard time seeing the upside of a situation first. The most logical reaction is to avoid harm. So those are the four types. And hopefully you guys all know what you are based on the survey, but I created it as bonus content for the book because everybody wants something fun to do. If you don't want to read the book, take the quiz.
So there's a couple of frameworks I want to have you talk us through a little bit. You provide a 5-factor framework for making a decision. Mm-hmm. And I actually, you give several different ways that it could be used, but then so can you talk about that a little bit? And then I'm going to read you something from the book that I think is fascinating.
Okay. Well, look, again, many of you, I'm sure, are great at making decisions. I don't want to presume you're good or bad. But I think the things that are unobvious in decision-making to people is, and this is why there is a 5-factor framework, is most people want to make a decision based on their goals. Great. Okay, that's obvious. Hey, here are my choices, here are my goals. That's only one factor in a decision-making criteria. I would say factor number 2 is sort of, what I call how this choice fits in who you fundamentally are, right? We increase our odds of success when we put ourselves in places where our skills and strengths are valued, where our values overlap with the environment we're entering, And where, you know, yes, I hope your passions and interests line up, but honestly, your passions and interests are what I call the top of a self-awareness sandwich. Sometimes they change. Sometimes they stay the same. Sometimes they change. But you know, one of the smartest ways to be a risk taker is obviously to put yourself, you know, in choices that complement what you're naturally great at, and where you feel like you're going to enter an environment that your values fit, right? It's so obvious. If you don't feel like your values fit, you're never going to take the most risk at work that you could be taking on a lot more impact. But the unobvious ones for people is people tend to think that we control our success. So we think like, hey, that's it. You know, does it suit me? And does it fit my ambitions? These are smart risks to take. But I think the smartest risk takers in the world know that, in fact, most risk taking is not about them. Which people are like, what do you mean it's about that? No, I'm like, no, it's actually not about you. I mean, we think we control all our success. I remember, I don't offer this in the book, but this is one of my favorite quotes from a company where I was an executive that was a slow grower in tech, which in tech to be a slow grower is like to die. But and the company, if I told you who it was, you would recognize it's large and it's public. And internally, you know, it's getting its lunch eaten by another public competitor. Yet, one of the most senior execs of the company would say, well, we have to earn the right to make new choices. Like, we need to execute better. And I'm like, you want to execute your way out of a bad environment? I would say that's really bad advice. So you're telling your team that if you just execute harder, then you'll have the right to make a new choice. I'm like, well, what if like the macro environment suggests you make that choice right now? I'd be like, hey, excuse my language, like, fuck, like working like extra hard on being perfect in execution. Because when you pick the right categories, you can be pretty imperfect in your execution and you'll still win, right? But most people don't want to take into account the tailwinds and the headwinds of a situation. They presume that risk-taking is entirely about your execution, and it's just not. So one of the third factors I talk about in the book is really the importance of headwinds and tailwinds. And then the last one I talk about is the who factor. Again, we're always in pursuit of the what. But if you look at some of the smartest risks, they really involve who you follow, who you work with. And again, I've been doing a version of this now, Risk Quiz. The book has been launched for 2 months. So I've now probably done 30 or 40 corporate talks. And in fact, we kind of survey people in, you know, live in every one of these talks on what helps people take more risk at work and what prevents them from taking more risk at work. And one of the number one things that shows up is people take more risk at work depending on who their manager is. And the direct team they're part of. It's not whether the CEO is a risk taker. It's not whether the company has a risk-taking strategy. It's what's happening in their microclimate. So it's the same thing, right? If you want to be a smart choice maker, we often focus on the what of our job content, but 3/4 of our job experience is about the who. Like, it's literally like, who do you choose to work for and with? Yeah. And so those are the 4 kind of what I call positive factors that I ask people to rate. And then on the negative side, which I think you were referencing, is there's like, and this is for bigger choices, like, you know, for smaller choices, I'm like, you know, do the calculus pretty quickly. But on bigger choices, the 5th factor is all the risk side of the equation, like true risk, true fear, like, and then we talk in the book about naming and sizing your fears. Ego risk, financial risk, and personal risk are mostly what holds us back. And on 99% of our daily choices to have more impact, it's about ego risk. It's about the fear of just looking stupid. Yeah. I mean, that is 99% of what holds people. The fear of failure, but just for the failure itself, not because it leads to financial failure, not because it leads to your family being unhappy with you. It's literally your personal crushing fear of failure. And so, you know, part of that and that 5-factor framework is just like analyze and literally like size the risk, you know, rate the upside, size the risk. So those are the 5 factors we talk about in the book.
Thanks for that. And I think it does help people hopefully lean into the book and get that value. I was expecting as I read it to be like, and if you go to my website, you can download this formula and you can use this in every decision you're going to make.
Uh-oh.
But what you did at the end of that section, she says, bear in mind, whether you use my framework or devise one of your own, the magic is not in the final way you score the choices you outlined, as much as it is in the process of scoring. When we can apply a methodology to name our possibilities and face our fears, we understand our decision-making criteria better and we make smarter big bets. I love that.
Thank you.
It's not about what framework you use. It's that you take the time to think it through and do the scoring and do that application.
Yeah. And I mean, I presume that most people, this is what I say, like, literally, if you're sitting here and thinking this is obvious, that's exactly what I thought when I wrote the book. So I won't be offended. I really am like, do people not do this? But I think what I have understood having written the book is that people really, you know, I think we're very reactive to the choice in front of us. I think people are remarkably reactive to the choice in front of them. And I think big choices scare us. And again, the premise of the book is get into motion, because you're probably 10 to 100 choices away from your reward. Like literally. So it doesn't matter what the first choice is. But you do want to give people a framework for bigger choices. I never make a bigger choice without like rating, assessing. Of course, we're all trying to be smart risk takers going into any situation. So you're not trying to say like, hey, just like make any choice. You know, you want to give people a tool that makes them feel like, okay, I can rate.
So at a more, I'm going to ask a couple more micro questions and then turn it over to the audience. At a more micro level, you've got some lovely uses of paradox in the book that I want to just read 3 of them that were strong for me and have you explain them a little bit or give us an example. One of them you said, optimism is a byproduct of risk-taking, not a precursor.
Yes.
And most of us think it's necessary to take a risk.
Yes. Yes. I actually don't think you need to be an optimist to be a risk taker. Which is like, people are like, what? Because I think that, how many of you read Good to Great? Some of you, a couple of you, a long time ago. Okay. So in Good to Great, there's a story that resonated with me greatly. And so I'll come to why I think this is important. First of all, Jim Collins tells a story of a guy named Jim Stockdale, who was a decorated Vietnam War veteran. And he's most famous for being, I think his plane was shot down during the Vietnam War, and he became a prisoner of war. But he actually, he sort of was the leader in his prisoner of war camp. And ultimately, I think through Morse code or something, actually helped, you know, get them released. Yes, get them released. But he was sort of the leader of this band of, you know, prisoners of war. And he sort of said like, hey, you would think that while we were here, the people who would survive the best would be the optimists. The answer is they're not, because every day they thought they were going to be rescued. And so when they weren't rescued every day, they were completely dejected. And he's like, then you'd think that it was the pessimists, you know, and like they were no better, because at the end of the day, like they thought they were never getting rescued. And that's an awful way to try and survive. But the people who could hold the duality of short-term pessimism and long-term optimism, you know, the people who had faith that ultimately they would be rescued, while being pretty clear-eyed that it wasn't happening tomorrow or was unlikely, were the people who fared the best. Okay, so that story really stuck with me when I read it many years ago. But I think we all presume like, hey, the way to become a risk taker is just jack up your optimism, just be this constant visualizer of success. And the problem is that when you just visualize success, it doesn't actually help you conquer your fear of failure, right? You're sort of like, you kind of want to avoid thinking about failure. But failure is a real option when you take a risk. Like, quite frankly, that's the reason it's called a risk. So for me, you know, what has often been true is that I actually go into pessimism mode when I'm trying to make a decision, because it's quite easy for me to ramp my, what I call FOMO, my fear of missing out. I can get myself very excited. My husband will tell you that. But the minute I really get into serious decision-making mode, I start looking at every failure point, and then I want to pre-mortem it, and I want to know how many choices I have if I fail. And if I can convince myself like, hey, if I fail, I still have 5 more choices, I feel like I can start to shrink the risk, right? So I get into action by being a pessimist, right? Not because I'm not an eternal optimist, right? But and the reason I think that optimism is the output, because imagine you enter a situation, you pre-mortem it, you know, you're excited, but you kind of look at all the failure scenarios, you shrink your fear of failure enough to act, and then the thing you fear happens. Okay, well then you choose your way out of it, right? Like my optimism now comes from the fact that I'm pretty sure I can choose my way out of any situation. I'm not sure I won't fail. In fact, I'm quite sure I will fail if I try something audacious. But if I know that I can still choose my way out of any situation, I am actually quite optimistic.
Yeah.
And so I feel like we tell people to be optimistic as an input, but I'm like, well, what if you embrace your inner risk manager? And I tell you that the minute you know you have agility and you have lived through that, you're far more likely to be optimistic about your future chances, because you don't count on success every time to be the necessary companion to being an optimist. You're like, it's not necessary.
Which is great, because the next paradox I was going to ask about, Humility is not the opposite of power, but it's valuable companion.
Mhm.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, I think the way to best describe this is in the book. If you believe in this thesis that the real reward for risk taking isn't the reward you imagined, you may or may not get it, right? But you're going to develop agility, right? If you become a choice maker and every cycle you try and produce output and you either get the result you wanted or you don't, but you learn from it and you make another choice. Ultimately, what you get is agility, right? And I always say to people, like, if you think power is about your achievement, power is really about your agility. Because the minute you know that you have agility, you feel fairly empowered. You feel like you have agency. You may not have agency over a situation because you're always in a situation that's not entirely in your control, but you have agency in your response. So I believe that power is something we generate for ourselves. But if you believe that power comes from perfection, again, it's quite crippling, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're like, look, I'm powerful as long as I'm perfect. I'm powerful as long as my track record is perfect. That is kind of a very crippling approach to power. If you believe that humility is sort of the companion, what you're really saying is, hey, guess what? Every time I run a cycle, every time I make a choice, every time I try and have impact, I'm at a minimum going to learn something, and that's going to make me even smarter. Like, then you really want to learn. You want to kind of embrace that side of yourself and be like, yeah, like I would rather feel like I can go out into the world feeling powerful because I know I can have agency even if I fail. But I want to say to you, like, I'm going to fail, like I'm going to be imperfect. So I would rather have that alongside me. And I think people who think that power by its very nature is about arrogance, I'm like, or perfection, I'm like, no, power sits right there. Empowerment sits right there with being willing, able, necessary, and embracing learning and understanding that, failure is transient.
And then the last one, still with power, is the more power you give away to others, the more you have.
Right. Well, I think it comes to this, feeling that I've long felt. I'm sure many of you know it. When we're early in our careers, we're sort of taught that like possibility is a zero-sum game. If I have it, you don't have it.
There's a level of scarcity.
Scarcity. I mean, I would say I know people who want to create environments of scarcity as senior executives. They somehow think that brings out the best in everybody. Is like, let's just pitch you all against each other.
Hunger Games.
Yeah, I mean, we know. So many of you will have been in Hunger Games situations, even as executives. But by and large, we've taught that there's scarcity. And as I said, once you learn that your ability to respond to any situation and keep choosing is your real superpower, you have all the power you need. Like, I don't need somebody to tell me I'm powerful. I don't need some, because I know that, people will tell me I'm powerful when my most recent choice in particular succeeds. And then when 3 more fail, somebody's going to say I'm not powerful. And I'm like, no, I'm just going to keep choosing. And ultimately, like, the law of probabilities will suggest that I will look like a winner again. But I think when you believe that you can create power for yourself, it's kind of a regenerative source. I don't need somebody to tell me I'm powerful. So if you can create it for yourself, and it's always regenerates, well, why don't you start giving it away? Like, why don't you create possibility for other people? Because the more you create for other people, then you can just generate more for yourself, give it more away, generate more for yourself. And so this idea that power is regenerative really kind of helps you understand why some people, live their lives becoming more and more powerful by creating possibility for others. And I don't even mean like altruistic possibility. I mean, literally, while you're in pursuit of ambition for yourself, what is the cost? I was having a conversation with somebody about, their company doesn't allow women to take board seats. And I'm like, okay, well, the one woman who does, like, what's the cost of lobbying, not just for herself, but for everybody else? Like, yeah, go pursue your own ambition. But like, the incremental effort to make something better for somebody else while you're doing it for yourself is not 1 + 1. It's like 1 + 1.2. Right. So every time we kind of, create possibility for others and others have more impact, by the way, you don't need people to tell you or give you credit for that. You just are generating more absolute power in the system, right? More absolute impact. And then, you can always generate it for yourself. And so you don't, that's how I think about that.
And I think that for me it's the joy of mentoring. It's the joy of hiring and training people who then go on to another organization. All of that is a sense of power as a regenerative quality rather than as a scarce
quality.
resource.
Right. Again, when we think our power comes from we're perfect. We own every decision. It's very hard to create other risk takers. It's very hard to create a risk-taking organization. It's hard to create other people who feel empowered. I mean, the list just goes on.
Yeah.
But again, I think that for most people, the idea that you don't need somebody else to tell you you're powerful, you can just keep generating it.
Yeah.
It's a fairly empowering place to be. And generating it even when you fail. I mean, I think that's the core thesis. How can you recognize that you're going to generate power even when you fail? And far more than you realize.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I want to turn to the audience and have this be not just a conversation between the two of us, but a conversation between all of us. Max has Amanda has a mic over here. We're going to ask that you ask your questions through the mic so that it's recorded well. And so who would like to jump into the conversation? Okay, over here.
Okay, so I have a question. So I read the book, The Paradox of Choice. I don't know if you've...
I haven't.
Okay.
I'm a very uneducated author.
No, it's okay.
It's
It's
actually good.
older kind of book, but
Please tell me the results.
so the premise of that book is basically the more choices we have in life,
The more paralyzing it is.
exactly, and we're more stressed as a society.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, too many choices.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm aware of this.
And so I'm wondering, especially with COVID and just the situation that we're in right now, because of all these choices that we've had to make and being kind of isolated, I think your book is about making a big choice, like a career type choice. And so I'm curious about the recommendation you'd make if you're so burnt out from making the smaller choices and you're looking to make a big career choice and you don't have the resilience or the
energy
to do it. What would you recommend with your framework to make sure you're in the mindset and to do it in the right way?
First of all, by the way, the book is not just about making big choices.
Okay.
The book is more about the act of frequently choosing, even if it's the minimum viable choice. And sometimes not choosing is a choice. So to be clear, right? But it's about realizing that the unlock of choices, and it's far more about frequency than it is about size of choice. So the book's thesis is you could get there with dozens of little choices, little, big, little, and you're just you can't predict the relationship between any single choice and its reward. You can predict a relationship over time. So first of all, I think there are two things about COVID that are important to recognize. Number one, we all had what's called a coconut moment. The book talks about, literally, there's a research term for subways and coconuts. Subways are events with known volatility. Your boss may be knowingly volatile, so you can predict their volatility every day. But literally a black swan moment, a coconut is like the risk that a coconut drops out of the sky, hits you on the head and kills you. And we all think that those risks never happen to us, and they happen to us at least several times in our lifetime. COVID is one, massive example. So two things happen during kind of these coconut events. Number one, we're actually far more rapid in our choice making instinctually to avoid disaster than we are for the upside, which in itself is ironic. Okay. So one of the reasons we avoid taking risk every day is because we think it's harmful, yet it's mostly for the upside. And then a black swan moment comes along, and to avoid true disaster, we're we all did it, right? So first of all, I think there's a lesson in COVID about our inherent agility, and that's, I think, to be harnessed. For when it's to be harnessed is a different question, because I think what you're pointing out is, okay, in a point of rapid change, change every day. Am I saying change tomorrow? No. What I'm saying is change when you're ready, but set a time frame and an intention. And more importantly, don't change once or don't choose once. Get into the practice of choosing. So I don't think it's about, hey, everybody, time to make a big choice. Many of you already made big choices, but I think it's about your relationship with agility and risk. And I think it's about many little choices. And in some cases, you may be so tired out that it's the minimum viable choice. I mean, I talk a lot in the book about how do you recover from failure? How do you recover from big choices that don't work out? How do you recover from something like COVID? Sometimes it's just about retrenchment. But I think that retrenchment itself is a choice. And then it's about when you're ready, how do you make the minimum viable choices, to increment your way multiple times towards your goal. That's more the way I think about it.
Great. Thank you. Other questions? Up here in the front?
Hi.
Hi.
So you said that this book, the concept of the book seemed obvious to you
Yes.
and to write it. So I'd love to hear, as you were writing it and doing the research and digging in, was there anything within the contents that you learned for yourself or offered a new perspective from something you thought was obvious that you're like, help frame for your own self in your research?
Yeah. Let me think about this. Well, first of all, unfortunately or fortunately, a book is entirely a product of an author's imagination. So, and in my case, like the book is written chronologically with stories from my career, but then stories from other leaders and then supported by research. So I wouldn't say that the research surprised me. I think the research that surprised me is the research that's not in the book, that the research I wished was untrue, which is a lot of research around gender-based risk-taking. So I deliberately did not write the book as a book about women taking more risk. I was like, it's not a book for women. This is a book for everybody who wants to make better choices. But I knew that there was a lot of specific research around the book on a lot of specific research on gender differences in risk taking. So I avoided researching them for the book. I literally did. I was like, I am not writing a chapter on how women need to take more risk. I'm not doing it. Like, I'm not doing it. This is a book for everybody. But I wanted to know the research for myself. And so when I looked at that research, what I wished to be not true was that women don't in fact take less risk than men. What I found to be true, and there's one meta-analysis that looks at over 150 different studies of the differences in risk-taking between men and women. And that meta-analysis found that on 14 of 16 dimensions in which they categorized all the different risk studies, women take less risk than men. So I was somewhat disappointed to find that to be true, because I didn't want it to be. Now, there were some silver nuggets in there, I'd say, for me as well. The silver nuggets were the gap in kind of women's adversity to risk. And by the way, the reason I like this meta study is it qualifies every type of risk: innocuous risk, the risk of speaking up, physical risk. Like, it literally looked at all these different studies and put risk into different buckets. So it really is any kind of uncertain choice. It declines with age and experience. So as women get more experience, the gap in risk adversity versus men declines. Number two, context matters, meaning everybody, men and women, are likely to take more risk in context that they value. So if you really care about a context, you're likely to take more risk. But number two, context in which they think they'll be successful, which then leads to the third piece of research, which is not so helpful, that, like everything else, there's a self-confirming bias on risk-taking. Women are perceived as taking less risk than men, so they find it more dangerous to take a risk, and thus they don't. So that issue about, like, you only take risks in context you feel you'll be successful, well, that's a double whammy for women, because, like, you know, like many other things, when people tell you you're more risk averse, then there's a confirming bias, and there's research on that too. So that is the thing I probably found in, like, writing this book, but was never in the book. And I was disappointed to learn it because there's this double-edged sword, right? Everyone's like, well, we want to encourage women and people of color to take more risks. But you don't want to do it from a place of being patronizing. I don't want to confirm the bias. I don't want to go out there and be like, take more risk. You need to be more ambitious, because I don't presume there are any, women are any less ambitious. But there's a fine line. In fact, the research suggests that they literally do take less risk, and even less of the good types of risk. And the research also says that men and boys are very indiscriminate when it comes to risk taking, and they'll take more of even the bad kinds of risks, but they have more shots at bat, and thus they succeed more. So I think there's just like this dichotomy, which is like, well, how do you encourage it without confirming the biases that the research suggests?
And so will that be your second book, the sequel to this?
I don't think so. I mean, honestly, for anybody who...
She told me that this may be her last
this
book.
may be
So
my
I'm
last
actually
book. I don't know. I am like, yeah, I
digging
don't...
a little bit.
But I will say, I really... this won't be my next book, because I really resist this notion that, you want to call out women or people of color and be like, take more risk, like you need to, I mean, I'm just like, it feels to me so patronizing that I will not write that book. But the research does suggest that there's truth to this, that we need to, figure out if we want to create equal access to opportunity.
Playing off that question and your answer to it before we go to somebody else in the audience, who were you thinking of as you wrote it? Like, as you're spending time in front of your laptop, who did you imagine would be your future readers?
Yeah, I mean, look, the book was really written for people from early career to, I'd say, mid-career and struggling with how to make a change. And I think what's happened, I think that is the strike zone for the book. I think what's happened is, and in both ways, very pleasantly surprised. I mean, I have people who are giving it to their like children who are as young as 7 or 12. And I'm like, really? Do they want to read a book on choice making in your career? I cannot tell you the number of pictures I've been sent of like people who've given it to their children who are like, I think the youngest might be 7. And they're reading the book. That's happening a lot with girls. And then on the other side, I've had a lot of people who were in my own peer group, like executives, CEOs, who are like, I thank you for reading the book. Nobody ever writing the book. I'm in this career transition. I'm struggling with this.
Yeah.
And it's just nice to read a book that's like, yeah, this stuff is hard, even when you're, very successful on the outside. So I think that's been another like welcome surprise that people are finding it useful later in their career.
Nice. Other questions? In the back, please.
Hi, very nice to meet you. I'm actually here to meet you, but because I just started my own company, and then I had to manage like an army of gentlemen, and then I was thinking for some advice, but I'm glad to discover your book.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna get one and read about it. And so I don't know much about this book, but I heard about this kind of sort of a systematic way, kind of looking at risk and how you kind of looking at choice, right?
Yes.
I feel like so I'm 29. When I was 22, 23, and a graduate top in my class, I have a lot of choice.
Yes.
I could go to hedge fund. I could go to investment banking. I could do my own startup.
Yeah.
And that time it was like very like, it was a lot of anxiety.
Yes.
And so I was thinking about like money, thinking about, like promotion, think about the possibility of make it and all that. But it's very unpredictable because you don't really know what's going to happen. So then eventually one day I got fed up, and then I start like the systematic way thinking to go, because like I think a lot of intelligent people are very hyper logical, and I think that stopped my potential. And so what I did is that I spent 2 years to work on myself with my therapist and executive coach, and I start grow as a person. Then I start become more like self-love and confidence and knowing what I want. And at that time I become more strong in the sense that like more like fearless, and risk in the same time start becoming more like attractive instead like fear.
Yes.
And risk start become a challenge, and I want to face risk and I want to get a challenge because I know, when I get over it, I would just be much stronger than ever. And then so when that happened, I left venture capital as a general partner and started my own company. And it's like the biggest shift or choice in my life, because as a GP, you literally just do few deals, and then everywhere you go, people treat you really well.
Yes.
And you just raise a bigger fund, 220, and a 10-year lockup, and it's pretty sweet every year.
Yeah.
And but now I work 120 hours a week.
Yeah.
I don't know what's happening tomorrow. Every time I wake up, there's a new problem to solve. You don't solve it, it's gonna be there. No one will do it for you.
Yeah.
And so now I don't know. Like I wish one day I can be like you, write a book, but I maybe more encourage them to throw away that logical side of it, throw away that kind of smart way, and really like look inside, because we're so busy. We're always thinking about promotion, but look inside. What do you really want to be? And maybe that's artist, and go do it. Maybe but be the best artist you can be.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, it's certainly one of the theses in the book is look at what you love and your gifts and your strengths. And that's certainly something, the whole reason to put a framework on anything is like, yes, it's as much art as it's science. But I think that people need structure even to take risk. Like that is actually right. Like if you just say to people, take risk, it's very daunting.
Yeah.
So putting a framework around anything, if you're trying to figure out how to take more risks, if you're trying to figure out who you are, if you're trying to create a team that is more innovative, like, I always say to people, like, you can't tell people to take risk without some structure. Like if you don't give them a structure, it's like, it's like, well, how do I start? So I do think that obviously your internal reflection is a core part of creating any risk-taking kind of activity or framework for yourself. It's probably one of the fundamental things I talk about in the book. But sometimes, and this is actually, I think, one of the core problems where I was like, look inside, but sometimes we're not sure who we are until we go through these processes. And by the process of choice making, we discover a lot more of who we are. So there's even this is even, I think, another false construction for people. People think I need to know exactly what I want and I need to know exactly who I am in order to have the right to take a risk. And I'm like, well, by its very nature, you're going to discover something about yourself through this process. So even there's just a lot of pressure to be exact in knowing so much about ourselves. And I think that's a kind of a false.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense. There's a question up here. Hi.
Hi. Well, I'm changing the topic a little bit, probably.
Sure.
Actually connecting with earlier on when you talk about there are different people in different career paths, different stage as well.
Yes.
In the earlier part or in the later part. And think probably everybody facing that once or twice in different phase of their career spot.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to think about, or maybe just giving some kind of thoughts around the glass ceiling kind of effects.
Sure.
Often that's not about risk taking, and possibly that is, but often you do have a lot of choice, especially if you are in a later part of your stage, you are executive in the company already. You do have a lot of choice, but you look around, the majority of them, it may not be the one that you want to be, or where does it move you even higher? So that ceiling above you, of course, you also have a lot of responsibility being the exec for the team, because there's a lot you have to do at the same time. So it's more of some of those thoughts that you share with that.
Sure. Well, first of all, my core thesis is there's possibilities abundant, but it's not evenly distributed. So to your point, it can be possible, we can talk about this as an environment of overall abundance, not scarcity. And by the way, we live in one of the places where possibility is most abundant. I think we can all, agree that generally, but that doesn't mean it's equally distributed, which just means some people have more than others by nature of the system, not, to your point, not by any of your own actions, right? You keep going and going and going. And then you bump into a ceiling that's not of your making. So first of all, I think that, I think there are two things in that situation that I say to people. First, unfortunately, glass ceilings don't take you off the hook on being a choice maker. That's the problem, right? If we bounce up against a ceiling, we can sort of say, well, the ceiling is there and it's there. And if anything, and I want to kind of double down on this, I think the biggest choices we have when we hit a glass ceiling are twofold. Number one, I'll keep saying what is our responsibility to try and, break that ceiling for ourselves and others. And by the way, there's an inherent risk when we do that. So this is the problem. When you are the other, the only of a kind, and you're like, oh, now it's my job to break the glass ceiling? Wait, isn't that another risk in addition to all the other risks I have to take at work? And the answer is that's true. So there's this is one of the frustrating paradigms, which is if you're hitting the glass ceiling, chances are nobody's calling it out for you. You actually have to call it out for yourself. And when you call it out for yourself, you have to call it out for others. Oh, and by the way, that has risk. That actually has legitimate risk in some companies, right? But what I say to people is when you hit a ceiling, to me, the difference in an organization where I'm going to stay and try and break through that ceiling versus one where I'm going to say, I give up, I give up, is about whether or not you are in an organization where you have values fit. Because I can guarantee in any organization we're all in, there's some level of bias, discrimination against some population. I'm not even saying it's against women, right? Against some minority population, there's a set of stereotypes. But when we feel like we're in organizations where we have, I call strong values overlap, that the organization shares to a large degree our sense of what is right, just, and fair, you may actually be willing to go think about, how do I break that glass ceiling? How do I push the envelope? How do I speak up? How do I identify something that I think is unfair or not working as it should? Because I think the organization's ability to receive my message is actually, I have some confidence and trust that they'll receive it as intended and process it.
Yeah.
And so I just want to note, I think your issue is very real. There's no doubting that there are possibility limiters that are systemic for some executives. I think our job as an executive, honestly, and I fairly and freely admit that if you are the minority population, you have the extra risk and burden of having to speak up to try and break the glass ceiling, which is itself unfortunate, right? This is why people talk about allyship. I'm like, well, why doesn't the other person speak up? Like, why do I get to speak up about that too? But that is the reality of where we live, right? Which is, I think our opportunity is, if we choose to speak up versus leave that situation, it's all about finding organizations and living inside of organizations where we feel like we have values fit.
Got it. I'm going to take executive privilege and take the last question, is there a mic in somebody's hand already? Okay, this will be our last question from the audience, wherever the mic lands. There we go.
Unfortunately, I probably don't need a microphone, but I haven't read the book yet, but I plan to. I have a question. You've been bringing it up a lot, and it may or may not be relevant or in context of, I've been in the work world a long time, and I started in a company that was very all about risk, and everyone was really on board with each other. And if you failed, it almost like was celebrated in a way. It was like, okay, let's kind of dissect what we learned. Since leaving there, I think one of the things that you've said a couple times, and I don't know if you have thoughts on this, is what are some ways to, when you're interviewing, to truly identify if your values match? Because interviewing is still such an awful, it's like you're talked at, or you're not really having conversations that are relevant, or it's like dating, right? It's like, great, we had a great coffee, but you end up being kind of an asshole. So I don't know, not me, obviously. But I don't, do you have any suggestions on how do you kind of
evaluate values?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, just to be generally speaking, I actually don't love interviews for this reason, because people can give a good interview. So generally I'm always like, it could be a great interview, it could be a poor interview. I actually am a big fan of like the back channel interview and the back channel reference, and even the forward reference if you ask the right question. Like, it doesn't need to be a sneaky reference, but because I actually do think interviewing is flawed. You're trying to get a picture into somebody's soul, right? In like a 30-minute interview. And is it about how well-spoken they are or who they truly are? Having said that, I will tell you, I, as a leader, in the reverse, I can't think about, in all of my interviews, so few people have asked me what my values are. I'm like, that's interesting. Come work for me. Do you care what my values are? So nobody ever asked me, they're asking me like, what's the thing about the organization? What's the strategy, right? Like, people are always asking what questions. What have you done? What have you achieved? I mean, honestly, if you guys were to look at how many of you, when you're interviewing others, have asked what their values are? Can they name them? And by the way, it's okay if they can't. It's okay if they've never been asked, right? But then just to stop and be like, pause and be like, yeah, maybe just share your own. Be like, okay, here's some of my values. Like, I don't think we reverse interview our bosses and ask like what their values are. I don't think we ask the people who work with them, like, what is this person like in their best moment? What is this person like in their worst moment? These are some of the questions I ask people. When you're stressed, how does it show up? What gives you energy at work? What drains your energy at work? And I'm actually looking for the honest answer, like, how self-aware are people of like, and so I think part of this is like people's self-awareness. They're not used to being asked these questions. So in some ways, in the forward interview, I want to ask the questions that are not really about the what, if that makes sense, because I think they're the ones that get people thinking. And then sometimes when you get the most honest response, does that make sense? Not the canned, like, sometimes it's
my
like,
weaknesses are really a strength because.
Oh yeah. By the way, that one's my favorite. Like, I'm always like, how do you test if people are agile? Like, what's a failure mode? Wow, I work too hard, and I'm the person who wants the most from the team, and so I just drive everybody else harder. I'm like, really? Like, so but I guess it's more in the honest questions up front that I feel like you might get an answer that's revealing, and not as a gotcha, just because like people stop and think, and they have this moment where like, oh yeah, I guess I'd have to, like, I don't know, what are my, and I encourage you to do the same in reverse. Like when you're interviewing to work with somebody, like, what are your values? So I think sometimes you'd be surprised what you can get out of a straight up question, because people aren't being used to being asked. So they're not like prepared or rehearsed. And then I think a lot of it is in the back chat, like, what's this person like to work with? Again, things like, not are they good or bad? Like, like, there wouldn't be a reference if somebody thought somebody was bad. But like, again, how does somebody show up when they're stressed? That is actually, I think, a really, how does somebody show up in their best moments? You know, what is this person's like, you know, what is this person, you know, what does this person show up like at their core? And I think that's different from like, what are their strengths? You know, so I always feel like values and things like that show up in the foxhole. So that's why I'm always looking for the questions around failure, around when you were in a difficult moment. How did, you know, what happened? What do you think you'd wish you'd done differently? Like, I'm just looking for that reveal. It's not easy, but sometimes, as I said, nobody ever asked me. So I often think that that's an opportunity.
From a communication coach point of view, my favorite question that I encourage my students and my clients to ask when they're interviewing is there anybody here in this organization that has worked for you in other places? Because all of a sudden I know, are they a Pied Piper that people want to follow them? Or are they somebody that is, you know, out for themselves or that doesn't end up having that? And then my follow-up question, when they say, yeah, there's 3 or 4 people that they were at the LA Times and now they've come over and worked for me here. I'm like, as a part of the process, could I interview with one of them?
Yeah, exactly.
Because that gets me to who is that boss at their best and worst moments.
Yeah, exactly. And I do, and again, I think it is really telling when you ask people, like, you know, what do you like when you're stressed? Like, when you're having your worst day, what does it look like? I think in some ways it's hard to test for values. I fully agree. Testing for self-awareness is so important. Like self-awareness is like that, you know, it's like one above values, right? Like if I can get to like how self-aware you are, then we can get to your values and have a really honest conversation. But yeah, how people show up when they're stressed tells you a lot about their values.
So this is the final question.
Sure.
You've done a lot of these interviews. You've done a lot of conversations about the book. What's the one question we didn't ask you that you wish you would have gotten? What's the one thing you would love to say as your final word?
Yeah, nobody asked me about how many times I failed, which is a lot, and I think that, you know, or like the risk maybe the risk I chose that didn't work out. And I, you know, in the book I talk about several, but one very notable one is I left Google at like literally the pinnacle of my career. I was, I don't know, the 12th VP at the company. I was, you know, arguably alongside Sheryl Sandberg, the most senior woman at Google and one of the most senior executives. And I left a 2,000 person organization in a multi-billion-dollar business to run a 10-person startup. And within 6 months, I was out. The founder decided he wanted the company back, and the board chose him over me. So I sacrificed. I made a very calculated choice and a big choice, and it just abjectly failed. But I would say to people, like, it failed if you looked at it over a 6-month time frame. But if you were to look at all the subsequent choices that started with that choice over a 10-year time frame, I get quite a bit of credit for being the CEO of StubHub, who sold it for $4 billion. And I'm like, yeah, just work back all of the decisions to that decision. Okay, over 30 decisions, over 30 choices, does it look like a pretty good win rate? Sure. At that moment, like, what a measured on one choice, an absolute fail. That's sort of the whole thesis of the book. Like, if you want to measure it on one, good luck. Like, that's called the stupidest risk taking I've ever seen. Bat once, hope for a home run.
Got it.
So let's just do the opposite.
Well, that is a great note to end on. And I want to thank you for making the choice to be with us in person tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. Hopefully the Warriors are winning.